Hi, my name is Mary, and today's video is a little bit different. It's my mid-year wrap-up. I figured it might be a little bit unfair to make people watch two almost hour-long videos of me giving micro-reviews of books to decide if they like me and like what I read. I was going to do that mid-year freak-out book tag and make a face like this in the thumbnail, but I didn't really vibe with the questions when I glanced over them. I don't read a lot of series or sequels, I don't get fictional crushes, I don't get extremely emotionally attached to characters, I don't watch that many movies and haven't seen a single book-to-film adaptation this year, and I don't write long and detailed book reviews generally speaking, nor have I uploaded that many videos to my channel. It's also a little fiction-centric, which is fair enough, but I do want to talk about nonfiction too. So instead, I'm going to do this my way. In this video, instead of doing book reviews, I'm going to be talking about my reading statistics, and then I'm going to do some, Mary's Choice Reading Awards for some outstanding good and bad books in various categories. I'm then going to wrap up the video with just a few notes about my plans for reading for the rest of the year. Ready? Let's go. So between January and June, I ended up reading 126 books. For the math whizzes out there, that means I finished a book roughly every 1.4 days, 1.5 days. Mostly, I think this comes about by not reading one book at a time, rather by picking up multiple books at once and always having an audiobook on hand. I use the Overdrive Libby app, which gives me free ebooks and audiobooks from my library. I should disclaim at the start of the video that I actually DNF'd 3 books. They're not included in the stats, they're not included in the 126 books, so just ignore these ones, okay? My worst reading month so far was May, when I was in a little bit of a reading slump and only read 12 books. The best reading month by far was June with 29. I think that definitely has to do with my Pride reading project and with starting BookTube in general. Anyways, that gives me an average of 21 books per month, which I'm pretty pleased with. So let's break this down a little bit further. In 2019, I read majority nonfiction with 63 books, then 56 fiction, and 7 poetry. Since I'm not going to dwell on the poetry a lot, let me just say that I am constantly on the hunt for good contemporary poetry. There were definitely some hits, some misses, some kind of average work, so I'll just have to keep trying and looking for new poets that really speak to me. Let me know if you have any recommendations down below. Let's talk about author demographics, starting with geography. Actually, I hate this graph, it's a mess, and we're not going to do that, so let's just switch to a regular map, okay? I read books from the United States, Canada, Mexico, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Brazil, Argentina, Morocco, Equatorial Guinea, South Africa, Australia, Pakistan, India, Taiwan, South Korea, North Korea, Japan, Russia, Finland, Sweden, Germany, United Kingdom, France, and Vatican City. So that's 24 countries this year. But Mary, aren't you forgetting someone? Oh yes, Rome! This year I also read Meditations by the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. That's this guy. It was definitely one of my top nonfiction reads of the year, so thank you, Marcus Aurelius. You more than made up for some of the absolute nonsense I did have to read this year. Moving on to other demographics, I also wanted to chart some of the gender distributions as well. About half of the books I read are by women, slightly fewer than half are by men. I also highlighted books by multiple authors, even if the author team were all the same gender, and then I read just 3 books by authors that I know to be non-binary. I would like to increase that number. We'll see how the rest of the year goes. Again, if you have any recommendations for non-binary authors, I would love to read them. All in all, when it comes to books that were either written by LGBT authors, or with LGBT subjects, or with LGBT main characters, I read a total of 30 books, most of them, of course, in June. Let's talk about the fiction books now. I wanted to see when the books I was reading were published. I divided these categories pretty arbitrarily into classics, or books written before 1900, modern classics, or works written between 1900 and 1980, backlisted books from 1980 to 2016, and new releases from the past 3 years, so 2017 through 2019. Backlisted definitely won the day here, but I know that for a fact I've been reading a lot more new release books in the past year than I ever have, and that's absolutely because of BookTube. Even more nebulously, I broke down the fiction into the genres to the best of my ability. Obviously, this is difficult because so many books straddle categories, so I just use my best judgment here. The biggest categories that I read are historical fiction, contemporary or literary fiction, and mystery thriller. If I'd done this chart about 5 years ago, almost the whole thing would have been fantasy, so it's nice to see that I'm diversifying the fiction that I'm reading. While we're here, I also want to highlight just a couple of the other tidbits about the things in the fiction that I read. I only read 2 young adult books this year, and I think it's safe for me to say that it's not going to be a big part of my reading pretty much ever. I also read 2 graphic novels or comics, and then 1 short story collection. I also want to point out that I don't read a lot of series. Actually, I only read 1 sequel this year, and that was because my favorite historical fiction of the year happened to be the first of a series. So, in addition to reading Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall, I also read the sequel Bring Up the Bodies, and they were both 5-star reads for me, and I'm so excited for the 3rd book in the series that comes out in March of 2020. As far as how long the books I read were, I wasn't terribly surprised by this breakdown. My biggest category is, of course, the 250 to 500 pages, which I think is the range that is most published novels ever. The longer the books are, the fewer of them that I read, but I also want to shout out the under 250 pages books that I was reading. 2019 has been a really great year for novellas for me, especially when it comes to international literature. Some of them are great, and some of them are not so good, but even the not so good ones are usually pretty bearable because at least they're over pretty quickly. The longest fiction book that I read this year was Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, which took me most of January to get through and clocked in at 1,463 pages. They don't call it The Brick for nothing. The shortest ended up being Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, which is basically a 108-page pamphlet about the dangers of lesbianism, so let's move on. Let's talk ratings. I don't give half stars in my reviews because I can't be bothered to add another layer of confusion. So on the list of 1 star to 5 star, I mostly favor 4 and 5 star. I used to worry that giving out too many of the 5 stars would mean that they weren't worth as much, but I don't really feel that way anymore. To be honest, now I feel like I'm getting to know my tastes all the better, and I can tell what books I'm going to like before I pick them up. If you're curious, the average fiction rating for me this year was 3.25 stars. Let's shift gears for a minute and talk about nonfiction. Obviously, the most popular genre I read this year was history. In addition to history, though, I read a few psychology, business, self-development, essay collections, nature writing, memoirs. If you look closely, you'll see that I broke history down into a few categories. As you can see, biography, true crime, and art history could have easily been included in history as a whole. I wanted to break down what kinds of history that I was reading, so for this next chart I combined my general history category with biography, true crime, and art history to get a better picture. Most books covered a wide range of history in them. After that, the biggest categories were 19th century, 20th century, and medieval, scattering of 18th century, early modern or Renaissance, and classical history. If you're curious, I only read a couple of non-Western history books, which is actually something I want to focus on correcting in my reading of the second half of the year, especially because I did enjoy both of these books. But that being said, I did read some really great non-Western memoirs, and I do feel more enriched for having done so. Sometimes it's nice to get a personal perspective on a country's history. On average, the nonfiction books that I read tended to be longer. I only read a few under 250 pages, but I also didn't read any that were over 750 pages. The longest ended up being Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela at 656 pages, and the shortest was a tiny little essay called We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which was 52 pages. Let's finally get to some awards and shoutouts. I'm not going to do my top favorite books, I'll save that for the end of the year, but I do want to give some shoutouts and make some observations about my own reading habits. I don't, generally speaking, look for comedic books because I do find that if an unfunny book is unfunny, it usually doesn't have enough else going for it for me to really enjoy it. Ahem, Beowulf for cretins, ahem. But despite that, I read some absolutely hysterical books so far this year, notably Alison Bechdel's The Essential Dykes to Watch Out For, which had me rolling with jokes about lesbian marriage conventions and also late 90s politics. Likewise, I read a couple of books this year that tried to tug at my heartstrings but fell flat, so we learned that not every book can scoot by on its subject matter alone to be emotionally effective. If you want truly sad books, here are some that got to me, especially Infidels by Abdallah Taya, which ripped my heart out and stomped on it, and I gave it 5 stars as a thank you. I also learned that there are a lot of ways that characters can get on my nerves. You can be a sad schmuck who's terrible at everything you do, you can be an asshole with a redemption arc that falls flat, or a wimpy pushover who never grows. That's not to say that I only like characters who are good people. I also found myself compelled by characters who were power-hungry, self-absorbed, and even static. I guess it really does come down to good writing. Who knew? Speaking of character flaws, let's talk about relationships. I only read a few actual romance novels, but that didn't stop the relationships in other books that I was reading from being absolute train wrecks. If there were a bad relationship bingo card, the books I read would have absolutely filled it. We had every kind of dysfunction in these books, although I'm pretty sure Samantha Downing's My Lovely Wife could win by itself, but I digress. Oh, but don't think nonfiction is free from my irritation. There were plenty of things that kept cropping up in the nonfiction that I was reading that got on my nerves, like dumbing down history for teenagers until you are leaving out important information, or filling your history book with pop culture and contemporary political references, or just being kind of an old dingbat. But my real fury is left for one book, and that is, of course, Georges Bataille's Tears of Eros, which I'm mostly just angry about because people I respect keep telling me I have to take Bataille seriously. No, thank you. This was a great year for child narrators whose naivete serves to highlight the ridiculousness of the adults around them, subtle speculative novels that verge on magical realism, and a lot of morally ambiguous women. In terms of nonfiction, it was a great year for true crime that didn't necessarily revolve around murder, totally unexpected histories, and nonfiction with absolutely gripping prose. So I did read some deeply disappointing books this year where I had great hopes for them that they did not meet, but it turns out that my new favorites for the first half of the year were all books that I didn't expect to fall in love with as much as I did. And since it's been such a good reading year, let's talk about some reading goals for the second half of the year. I set my Goodreads goals for 2019 to 100 books, and since I met that at the end of May, I think it might be time to hit it up and go to 170 books. The reason I'm not aiming to double the amount of books I've already read this year in the second half of the year is that I'm moving at the end of July and starting graduate school in the middle of August. I'm going to be reading a lot, but not for leisure, so I think adding an additional 40-ish books to the second half of the year is a reasonable goal for me to meet. When it comes to specific reading focuses, I definitely want to continue reading international literature for my project of reading a book from every country. I have a whole video about that goal, so look for that on my channel if you haven't seen it already. I also have a few classics I've been meaning to read. I was aiming for one a month during the first half of the year, but I think I can bring the focus more towards those for the second half of the year and read a bunch more, including North and South, The Woman in White, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and The Song of Roland, among others. I also briefly mentioned wanting to read history from places outside of Europe and North America, so I'll be keeping an eye open for books that fit that description. I would also like to read more short story collections after reading Ficciones by Jorge Luis Borges and absolutely adoring it earlier this year. Next, I want to keep in mind seasonal reading. What does that mean? Well, it means reading summery books in the summer, autumnal books in the autumn, and wintry books in the winter. Makes enough sense, right? Good. Moving on. I did a big focus on LGBT books in June of this year for Pride Month, and I still want to keep that one in the second half of the year. Definitely keep that going because, Pride. I also want to read more medieval history, 19th century history, and art criticism and history. These should be pretty easy because they're my main academic focus, and so to be honest, they might be all I read, depending on how this year goes. Lastly, contemporary politics. As most of you will be aware, in November of 2020, Americans are going to have another one of those pesky presidential elections where the two main parties duke it out to see who can alienate the other half of the country the hardest. In an effort to be an informed citizen, I'm planning some political reading for the next half of this year and throughout 2020. Look for a video on that in the autumn. So those are my focuses. You'll also find the same mix of history, art history, historical fiction, and literary fiction that I typically read, including some books by authors that I've read previously this year and know I really want to read more from. When it comes to the channel, I've been uploading quite a few videos recently just to get some content out there. I think I'm happy that now you can tell the types of videos that I want to do, especially wrap-ups, tags, individual book reviews, reading recommendations, and updates for my Global Reading Challenge. I also hope to add some videos about graduate school. We'll have to see how it goes this coming semester. So while I'm probably not going to be uploading as much as I have been in the last couple of weeks, I do have a bunch of plans for new content. I'm really pleased with how the first half of this year went. I think I read some really great books, and I'm excited for the next half of the year will bring, especially with BookTube. That's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Bye!